There are leaders who announce themselves early, and there are those who seem to appear from the dust, as if no one quite noticed the moment they began to matter. Saddam Hussein belongs to the second group. To understand him, historians often return not to palaces or parade grounds, but to a boy in northern Iraq, raised in a place where power was not abstract and safety was not promised. The town was al-Auja, a hamlet outside Tikrit, resting along the Tigris. It was not a strategic place in any formal sense. It was not wealthy. It was not influential. But it sat inside a dense web of kinship, tribal codes, and vendettas that predated the modern Iraqi state. This is where Saddam Hussein was born, in April 1937. The records are sparse. Some details are uncertain. Even the precise circumstances of his birth are disputed. What is consistent is the silence around his father. His father, Hussein Abd al-Majid, disappears from the story before it begins. Some accounts say he died of illness months before Saddam was born. Others suggest he vanished, leaving the family without explanation. There is no firm documentation, only family recollections passed down in fragments. The absence mattered. In rural Iraq of the 1930s, a household without a male protector existed in a fragile position. Honor, inheritance, and safety were tied to male lineage. Without it, the family became dependent on the tolerance of relatives. Saddam's mother, Shuba Tulfah al-Musalat, was young and isolated. It is believed she was deeply depressed after her husband's disappearance and the earlier death of an infant son. Some biographers describe her as overwhelmed, even resentful of the child she was carrying. There is a story, not fully verifiable, that she attempted to abort the pregnancy or contemplated suicide. The record remains unclear, but the story itself has endured. And endurance suggests something about how Saddam later wanted his beginnings remembered, as unwanted, precarious, already entangled with rejection. Eventually, Shuba sent the infant to live with her brother, Khairallah Tulfah. This transfer would quietly shape the next decades. Khairallah Tulfah was not a gentle figure. He was a former army officer, dismissed from service for nationalist agitation against the British-backed monarchy. He held rigid views about Arab pride, betrayal, and humiliation. He had spent time in prison. He carried grievances like heirlooms. For a boy growing up under his authority, these grievances were not political theory. They were household atmosphere. Khairallah filled the home with stories of lost Arab dignity, of conspiracies, of traitors within. He spoke bitterly of imperial interference. Jews, Persians, and Westerners appeared in his narratives not as individuals, but as forces. Historians suggest that this environment did not give Saddam ideology in any systematic sense, but it gave him a framework. The idea that the world was structured around domination and resistance, loyalty and betrayal. Schooling came late. Saddam did not enter formal education until he was around 10. He was illiterate into adolescence. This delay isolated him from peers and formal authority alike. He was physically small, reportedly aggressive, and prone to fights. By the time his mother remarried and summoned him back to live with her, the household dynamic did not improve. His stepfather, Hassan Ibrahim, was a laborer. Accounts describe him as violent. Saddam later claimed he was beaten with a stick wrapped in tar. The detail appears frequently, but again, the record is unclear. What is clear is that Saddam did not remain long. He ran away. He returned to Khairallah in Tikrit, crossing fields on foot, a boy moving between households as if neither fully wanted him. The pattern would not end here. Tikrit was not large, but it was tight. The town was structured around clans, al-Majid being among the most prominent. Honor disputes could last decades. Feuds were not written down, but they were remembered. Everyone knew who owed whom. Everyone knew which families had aligned with which powers during earlier conflicts. The modern Iraqi state had technically existed since 1932, but in Tikrit, law still felt personal. Justice was less about courts than about reputation and retaliation. In such places, identity is not chosen, it is inherited. Saddam grew up learning who he belonged to long before he learned what he believed. Despite clan ties, he was not a natural heir to local leadership. He had no land, his household was unstable, he was not academically gifted. Teachers later described him as determined but undistinguished. He memorized when necessary. He endured when required. Yet endurance has its own effect on character. He learned early that vulnerability was dangerous, that dependency could be humiliating, that strength was something performed, not granted. Iraq in the 1940s was unsettled. The British had shaped the monarchy after World War I, installing Faisal as king and retaining heavy influence over military and oil policy. By the time Saddam was a child, resentment simmered across urban and rural populations alike. There had already been a nationalist coup in 1941, briefly ousting the pro-British government before British forces returned. The lesson was not forgotten. Foreign powers could be challenged, but not easily expelled. To a boy listening to his uncle's stories, the state did not appear as protector, it appeared as occupier. Saddam was not known for speaking much as a youth. Those who later recalled him described a quiet intensity, not introspective but guarded. He did not tell stories, he stored them. He did not seek approval, he observed who distributed it. This may explain why he was drawn not to literature or philosophy, but to structures, party cells, hierarchies, rules of advancement. At some point in his late teens, he moved to Baghdad to continue schooling. He failed the entrance exam for the prestigious military academy, an event that biographers treat as minor but suggestive. Rejection would recur in his life. So would the refusal to accept it. It is tempting to retroactively assign Saddam a political identity in childhood. But the evidence resists this. He was not yet Ba'athist. He was not yet Islamist or secularist in any coherent way. What he possessed instead was a sensibility, the conviction that dignity was scarce, that it had been stolen, and that it could only be recovered by those willing to take it. Historians suggest that his formative years were less about ideas and more about conditions: poverty, instability, clan memory, and grievance, transmitted through kinship rather than textbooks. This is not destiny. Many grew up in Tikrit without becoming autocrats. But it is environment. When Saddam looked forward, there was no estate waiting, no career assured, no respected surname that could open doors. There was only movement, between households, between cities, between roles he had not yet acquired. In Baghdad, he would soon encounter organized politics. He would find in the Ba'ath Party not just doctrine, but a ladder, a way to climb without pedigree, to belong without lineage. But that belongs to another chapter. For now, there is only the boy, shuttled between guardians, shaped by stories of humiliation, aware that protection must be built, not expected. It is difficult to pinpoint the moment when resentment becomes ambition. The record does not preserve it. What remains is a sense that long before Saddam Hussein acquired a state, he had already learned to live without one. There is often a temptation to treat political awakening as revelation, as if one morning a young man reads the right book, hears the right speech, and discovers who he is meant to become. With Saddam Hussein, historians describe something slower, almost procedural. Not conversion, but alignment. By the mid-1950s, he was no longer a boy from Al-Awja drifting between households. He was in Baghdad, a city still uneasy under monarchy. Its streets crowded with students, soldiers, and pamphlets, each competing to define Iraq's future. Saddam arrived without distinction. He had failed the military academy entrance exam. He had no money. He lodged with relatives. He was already older than many classmates, a reminder that his education had been delayed not by laziness, but by circumstances that had left him behind. Yet Baghdad was not Tikrit. It did not operate on clan memory alone. It had organizations. The Ba'ath Party was not large at this stage. Founded in Damascus by Michel Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Ditar, it preached Arab unity, socialism, and secular nationalism. Its ideology was vague enough to absorb many frustrations: humiliation by foreign powers, corruption of monarchies, the promise of a single Arab nation transcending borders. But ideology may not have been the initial draw. The party offered something more practical: cells, ranks, missions, a way to become relevant without inheritance. Saddam joined the Iraqi Ba'ath in 1957. He was 20. No documents describe an emotional commitment. There is no recorded statement of belief. What survives are reports of diligence. He attended meetings. He distributed leaflets. He listened. Within party circles, he did not present himself as intellectual. Others debated doctrine. Saddam volunteered for errands. He learned names. He remembered debts. It is here that historians begin to observe a pattern. He advanced not through charisma, but through reliability. Iraq's political climate deteriorated rapidly. In 1958, the monarchy was overthrown in a bloody coup led by General Abd al-Karim Qasim. King Faisal II was killed. His body was dragged through the streets. The old order collapsed in a day. For many Iraqis, this was liberation. For the Ba'ath, it was opportunity, but also disappointment. Qasim consolidated power rather than sharing it. He marginalized Ba'athists, favored Iraqi nationalism over pan-Arabism, and aligned with the communists. This created an enemy. By 1959, Ba'ath cells were discussing removal, not reform. Saddam was recruited into a small group assigned to assassinate Qasim. The operation failed. Accounts vary on the details. It is believed Saddam fired at Qasim's car and was wounded in the leg during the escape. Others in the group were killed or captured. Saddam fled across the border to Syria, then to Egypt. It was his first direct encounter with the state as adversary and with violence as instrument. The consequences were formative. In Cairo, Saddam lived among Iraqi exiles and pan-Arab activists. He enrolled in law classes at Cairo University, though there is no evidence he distinguished himself academically. What Cairo offered was not scholarship, but proximity to power. Gamal Abdel Nasser ruled Egypt, embodying the Arab nationalist dream. The radio carried his speeches across the region. To young Ba'athists, he was proof that ideology could seize the state. Saddam observed. The record suggests he did not become an orator. He did not write essays. Instead, he cultivated contacts. He learned how exiles organize, how networks survive outside borders, how loyalty hardens under threat. He was also, at this point, a wanted man back home. This mattered. To be outlawed by one's own government is not only a legal condition, it alters the way authority is perceived. The state becomes not abstract, but personal, a force that hunts. In 1963, another coup overthrew Qasim. The Ba'ath briefly seized power in Baghdad. Saddam returned. He was not yet prominent, but he was assigned to the party's internal security apparatus, a shadow structure responsible for monitoring rivals, infiltrating institutions, and neutralizing threats. It is difficult to trace precise actions. These units did not keep transparent records. What is clear is that Saddam was no longer simply participating. He was enforcing. Within months, the Ba'ath regime collapsed under internal conflict and military resistance. Saddam was arrested in 1964. Prison, again, became education. Saddam did not experience imprisonment as isolation. Iraqi prisons at the time were crowded with political detainees, Baathists, communists, Nasserists. They debated, recruited, organized. Guards were bribed. Messages passed between cells. Here Saddam's reputation grew. He was not the most articulate, but he was dependable. He smuggled notes. He mediated disputes. He cultivated relationships with officers outside the walls. In 1966, he escaped. Details remain uncertain, but it is believed he bribed guards and walked out disguised. Escape itself became part of the myth. Within Ba'ath circles, it marked him as resourceful, committed, and lucky. Luck, however, is a story people tell afterward. The Ba'ath returned to power in 1968 through another military coup. This time, it lasted. Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr became president. He was from Tikrit, older, cautious. Saddam was appointed vice chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, a position without formal definition but immense operational reach. From the outside, he still seemed secondary. From the inside, he was everywhere. He oversaw security services. He managed purges. He placed loyalists in ministries, intelligence units, regional commands. Historians suggest that Saddam's formative years did not teach him what to believe. They taught him where belief ends and leverage begins. He had learned the value of secrecy from exile, of discipline from cells, of surveillance from prison, of contingency from failure. He had also learned something quieter, that power is not seized only in moments of upheaval. It is accumulated in corridors, in files, in lists of names. By the early 1970s, Saddam Hussein had not yet become the face of Iraq, but he had become its nervous system. And this raises a question that the record does not fully answer. At what point does a functionary stop serving a system and begin designing it? There is no announcement when that shift occurs, only the slow disappearance of those who once stood in the way. Power does not always arrive with ceremony. Sometimes it arrives by attrition, when the people who might oppose it are already gone. By the early 1970s, Saddam Hussein had become indispensable to the Iraqi state without formally leading it. President Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr remained the public figure. He signed decrees, he received foreign visitors. He was older, genial, from the same Tikriti networks that had brought Saddam into proximity. But behind this facade, the machinery of authority had begun to rotate around a different axis. Saddam's official title, Vice Chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, conveyed little. His real influence lay in what he supervised: intelligence, internal security, and the Ba'ath Party's organizational core. Historians suggest that this period marked a shift from improvisation to system. Multiple security services were created with overlapping mandates. The General Intelligence Directorate, the Special Security Organization, military intelligence units. Each monitored not only the population, but each other. No institution was permitted to exist without a rival shadowing it. This redundancy was not inefficiency. It was design. Reports flowed upward. Loyalty was measured not by speeches, but by signatures on denunciations, by attendance at closed meetings, by the quiet willingness to inform on colleagues. Fear became administrative. In 1972, Iraq nationalized its oil industry. The timing mattered. Global oil prices surged after the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. Revenue flooded state coffers. Baghdad began to transform. New roads, hospitals, schools, subsidized food, expanded literacy campaigns, rural electrification. Women entered universities in larger numbers than before. To many Iraqis, the state finally appeared tangible. Saddam was instrumental in this expansion. He negotiated oil deals, hosted delegations, presented Iraq as modernizing, disciplined, sovereign. This was not merely economic policy, it was narrative construction. The message was subtle. Stability produces prosperity, and stability has a custodian. Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr aged. He remained president, but he retreated from daily management. Health problems were cited, but insiders later described a different dynamic. Saddam had assumed so many operational responsibilities that al-Bakr no longer controlled the levers that mattered. The security services reported to Saddam. The Ba'ath Party cadres owed him their positions. Provincial governors depended on his favor. No coup was staged. No manifesto announced transition. Instead, authority was transferred through routine. By 1979, the question was no longer whether Saddam could rule. It was why he had not yet formalized it. In July 1979, Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr resigned. Officially, it was for health reasons. Unofficially, few doubted the direction of pressure. Saddam became president of Iraq, Secretary General of the Ba'ath Party, and chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council. Titles accumulated, but they were not the true turning point. That came days later. At a Ba'ath Party conference, senior officials gathered. The meeting was filmed. Saddam appeared calm, almost detached. He read from a list, announcing the discovery of a conspiracy within the party. Names were called. Men were escorted from the room. Some were later executed. The broadcast was shown repeatedly on Iraqi television. Historians have debated the purpose. It was not secrecy, it was demonstration. Power was no longer procedural, it was performative. After the purge, a pattern emerged. Officials competed not only in obedience but in visible affirmation. Speeches praised Saddam's wisdom. Portraits appeared in offices, classrooms, shops. Slogans multiplied. This was not mere cult of personality. It was an audit system. Public enthusiasm became proof of private reliability. Silence, once Saddam's own refuge, now appeared dangerous. Yet there is little evidence that Saddam sought adoration for emotional reasons. Observers describe him as controlled, rarely spontaneous, measuring rather than basking. The performance served a function: to make disloyalty costly before it was even conceived. By the late 1970s, Iraq was richer, more literate, more urbanized than at any previous point in its history. but it was also more surveilled. Citizens were encouraged to inform on neighbors. Party membership became prerequisite for advancement. Ethnic and sectarian identities were managed through a combination of patronage and intimidation. Kurds were alternately courted and crushed. Shia religious networks were tolerated, then restricted. Sunni dominance was not always explicit, but it structured appointments. The system did not aim to resolve difference. It aimed to freeze it. Foreign diplomats often noted Saddam's demeanor. He was polite, attentive, well-briefed. He quoted statistics. He asked detailed questions. He appeared less theatrical than other regional leaders. This dissonance puzzled observers. How could the same man who ordered mass arrests also cultivate an image of rational modernity? Perhaps because he did not experience these as contradictions. In Saddam's framework, order was not opposed to violence, it was sustained by it. By the end of the decade, he had consolidated authority over a state transformed by oil wealth and disciplined by fear. And yet, the record suggests he did not believe the structure was complete. Security services continued to expand. Files grew thicker. Surveillance extended deeper into professional associations, universities, even families. Power, once acquired, had become something to be defended against possibility itself. It is difficult to identify the precise moment when consolidation turns into paranoia. The archives do not label it. But by 1980, Iraq was armed, confident, and enclosed within a system that could not tolerate uncertainty. And systems that cannot tolerate uncertainty eventually seek an enemy. When a state is built to prevent surprise, it begins to fear stillness. By the end of the 1970s, Iraq was wealthy, centralized, and internally silent. Opposition had not disappeared, but it had been pushed underground, fragmented, and isolated from any visible means of coordination. From the perspective of Baghdad, this quiet could be mistaken for completion. Yet, historians note that regimes structured around permanent vigilance rarely experience satisfaction. They interpret the absence of threats not as stability, but as concealment. It is in this atmosphere that Saddam Hussein made his most consequential decision. In September 1980, Iraqi forces crossed into Iran. Officially, the invasion was framed as a defensive measure, a response to border violations, a preemption against revolutionary Shia influence spilling westward after Iran's 1979 revolution. Privately, Ba'ath officials spoke of opportunity. Iran was disorganized, its officer corps purged, its economy in flux. The calculation seemed simple. It was wrong. What followed was not a campaign, but a condition. 8 years of attrition that drained both countries while resolving little. Trench warfare returned to the Middle East. Human wave assaults met artillery barrages. Chemical weapons were introduced as tactical instruments. The war did not merely consume soldiers, it consumed institutions. Oil revenues were diverted to arms. Civilian infrastructure deteriorated. The promise of the 1970s, education, welfare, modernization, receded into rationing and propaganda. Saddam did not retreat from the conflict even as costs mounted. Some historians argue that withdrawal had become structurally impossible. A system built on certainty cannot easily admit miscalculation. To end the war without victory would have exposed not only a strategic error, but the limits of infallibility itself. As casualties rose, the regime intensified internal controls. Draft evasion was punished severely. Families of deserters faced collective sanctions. Party officials were ordered to monitor morale. At the same time, Saddam turned decisively against Shia religious networks, accusing them of Iranian loyalty. The Dawa party was outlawed. Clerics were imprisoned or executed. The message was not theological, it was territorial. Kurdish regions in the north were treated as security zones rather than provinces. Villages were razed, populations were relocated. The Anfal campaign of the late 1980s included mass arrests, disappearances, and the use of chemical agents against civilian areas such as Halabja. The state did not present these actions as atrocities. It classified them as administration. Language mattered. In 1988, the Iran-Iraq War ended with no decisive territorial changes. Both governments declared victory. Iraq emerged with one of the largest armies in the region and debts exceeding tens of billions of dollars. Its infrastructure was damaged, its population traumatized, its youth depleted. Saddam's response was not introspection but recalibration. He demanded debt forgiveness from Gulf states, framing Iraq as the shield that had protected Arab monarchies from the Iranian Revolution. Kuwait's refusal became a grievance. The pattern was familiar: economic pressure interpreted as political hostility. In August 1990, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait. The rationale blended historical claims, oil pricing disputes, and accusations of theft from shared oil fields. But beneath these arguments lay something less articulated: the need for resolution. The war with Iran had not produced closure. It had produced debt, fatigue, and the faint suggestion that Iraq's sacrifices were being forgotten. Kuwait offered a scenario where power could again appear decisive. Instead, it triggered international coalition. Operation Desert Storm in early 1991 dismantled much of Iraq's military infrastructure in weeks. Precision bombing replaced trench warfare. The aura of invulnerability evaporated. Yet the regime survived. After the ceasefire, uprisings erupted in the south and north. Shia communities rebelled. Kurdish regions broke from central control. The Iraqi army, though battered, suppressed the southern revolt. In the north, Western-imposed no-fly zones created a semi-autonomous Kurdish region. Saddam reasserted authority where he could. What remained of the state reorganized around endurance rather than expansion. Sanctions followed, comprehensive, prolonged, eroding everyday life. Imports collapsed. Hospitals lacked supplies. Malnutrition spread. Middle-class professionals sold furniture to buy food. The regime persisted. Historians debate how this was possible. Some point to coercion, others to the fragmentation of opposition, others to the strategic distribution of scarcity, rewarding loyal districts, punishing others. Perhaps it was all of these. By the late 1990s, Iraq no longer resembled the modernizing republic of the 1970s. It was poorer, more isolated, more inward. But the security apparatus remained intact. Files were still kept. Meetings were still monitored. Portraits still hung. The state had lost its future, but retained its habits. And Saddam remained at its center, older now, more cautious, speaking less in public, appearing mostly at orchestrated events. The question that emerges from this period is not how he survived, but what survival had come to mean. Power had once promised dignity, restoration, unity. Now it promised only continuation. There is something unsettling about a system that endures after its original purpose has dissolved. It suggests that control, once established, can outlive the reasons that justified it and become reason enough itself. There are regimes that collapse with noise, and there are those that persist long after their internal logic has faded, held together by repetition rather than conviction. By the early 2000s, Saddam Hussein presided over such a state. Iraq remained formally sovereign. Its institutions still bore names and ranks. Ministries issued decrees. Party offices opened each morning. But the conditions that had once animated the system, oil prosperity, regional ambition, ideological certainty, had thinned to ritual. What remained was survival as routine. After the Gulf War, Iraq was subjected to an inspection regime unlike any imposed on a modern state. United Nations teams searched for prohibited weapons programs, dismantling facilities, reviewing documents, interviewing scientists. The relationship between Baghdad and the inspectors was adversarial from the outset. Iraqi officials obstructed access. They delayed, negotiated, staged compliance. Inspectors reported inconsistencies, missing records, ambiguous cooperation. Each report fed a cycle of suspicion. Historians note that the weapons programs themselves had largely collapsed by the mid-1990s. Infrastructure was damaged, funding scarce, expertise scattered. But the ambiguity surrounding them persisted. This ambiguity became politically functional. For Saddam, acknowledging full disarmament risked revealing weakness. For Washington and London, uncertainty justified pressure. Between these positions, evidence was less important than posture. For ordinary Iraqis, sanctions were not a policy, they were environment. Food rations became the primary source of nutrition for many families. Doctors reused equipment meant to be disposable. Engineers repaired machinery without parts. Entire professions narrowed to improvisation. The regime adapted. State television emphasized endurance. Officials framed hardship as resistance. Blame was assigned outward, not upward. Yet internal documents later suggested that the leadership understood the cost. The suffering was not invisible. It was calculated. Saddam rarely appeared in public. When he did, it was often in controlled settings, visiting mosques, touring factories, addressing loyalists. His image had shifted from commanding modernizer to stoic survivor. It is unclear whether he believed this narrative or simply inhabited it. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the strategic context changed. Iraq was reframed not as a contained problem, but as an unresolved threat. Accusations of hidden weapons, links to terrorism, and defiance of international norms converged. From Baghdad, these claims were perceived through a familiar lens: siege, conspiracy, humiliation. Saddam did not flee. Some historians interpret this as miscalculation, others as ideological rigidity, others as structural inertia. A regime designed to confront enemies may not recognize when its own premises have expired. In March 2003, the invasion began. Within weeks, Baghdad fell. The institutions that had taken decades to construct dissolved with startling speed. Police stations were abandoned. Archives were looted. Ministries emptied. Power did not transfer. It vanished. For months, Saddam remained at large. When he was finally found in December 2003, it was not in a palace or command center, but in a small underground hideaway near Tikrit, a space that barely permitted standing. The image circulated worldwide. A former president examined for lice, silent. Some saw humiliation, others saw inevitability. The record does not preserve his internal state, only the external contrast. The architect of a surveillance state reduced to concealment. His trial began in 2005. The proceedings were chaotic. Judges replaced, lawyers killed, evidence contested. Saddam challenged the court's legitimacy, refused to recognize its authority, invoked sovereignty that no longer existed. The charges focused on the 1982 killing of villagers into jail, not the full breadth of his rule. This selectivity frustrated many Iraqis, but it simplified the legal narrative. In November 2006, he was sentenced to death. He was executed the following month. There was no state funeral. With Saddam gone, Iraq did not settle. Sectarian violence intensified, militias proliferated, institutions struggled to reassemble under new authorities. The country did not return to the 1970s. It did not even return to 2002. It entered something else, a prolonged attempt to exist without the architecture that had once defined it. Historians disagree on how Saddam should be placed within this outcome. Some describe him as the product of Iraq's fractures, not their source. Others argue that his system institutionalized fear so thoroughly that it hollowed the state from within, leaving nothing resilient behind. Perhaps both are true. It is tempting to end biographies with verdicts. But Saddam Hussein resists closure. Was he primarily a nationalist who mistook control for unity, a survivor who turned endurance into doctrine, or a bureaucrat of fear who never escaped the conditions that shaped him? The boy from Al-Awja had once learned to navigate a world without protection. Decades later, he had constructed a nation that could not protect itself without him. And when he disappeared, the structure did not reveal its strength, only the space where it had been.